Good day and welcome to The Woman Show. I'm Lenina Rasool, and today we are going to be speaking about sex. Now, when I was a little kid, I had a very binary idea of language. Because we learned English and Afrikaans equally, I believed that there was an English and an Afrikaans version of every language. Like, seriously, English and Afrikaans version for German, English and Afrikaans version for French, and you get my drift. I'm not sure when or how that bubble burst, but when I realized that every language was a language in its own right, I struggled to wrap my head around it. Now, I'm telling that story because the way I thought about language as a 7-year old is the same way we think about gender and sexuality. We think it's binary, made up of two, male and female, and that sex happens between males and females only. But life has never actually really worked like that, and neither has love. Today on The Woman Show, we are going to be looking at gender and sexuality and sex and pleasure. After the break, we're going to be speaking to Kanyisa Booi, who is the founding editor of a digital magazine called Eve's Apple that discusses all this and more. But before that, we're going to have a look at a short video about Eve's Apple, what it is, what it does, what it publishes, what it says, and open up the context for our conversation later. Let's have a look.
Eve's Apple the Mag is a feminist digital sexual and reproductive health and pleasure magazine aimed at ensuring access to verifiable, uncensored, bold, and simple sexual and reproductive health information. The magazine encourages NGOs, institutions, groupings with a sexual and reproductive health and its intersections to take up space in sharing research works, learnings, and successes. Eve's Apple curates these content chunks into magazine formats because the evolution of health communications is critical in ensuring that information is memorable and reaches the pocket of society that it is intended for. The reason why Eve's Apple was started is because we realized that popular culture plays a big role in the consumption of information, and we realize also that though information on sexual health is out there, it's not necessarily information that people find actionable. So the critical nature of the existence of the magazine is planted in the understanding that people want information in its light form, and they want it to be visual, they want it to be simple. But also what's really, really important is that the information be verifiable. So when you've interacted with the platform, you want to be certain that this information is not fake news. And also that we forget that pleasure is a very critical part of sexual health as well. So it is a combination of information on what health is, on what ill health is, and how to access health. Additionally to that, what pleasure is and what that looks like, and how you can seek it out and begin to enjoy it. The reason why it's important to publish Eve's Apple the Mag and to have it existing is to say to people like you and me, it's normal, it's natural, there's nothing wrong with you. Seeking out pleasure is important. It's a fundamental need, just like eating. Health access is your right, and this is where you can get it. Not knowing, not understanding is part of the human journey. Here's information that you may need. Here's information you may need for your peers. Here's information that you may need for your children. And so having a publication like this, which is primarily by and for brown people, black people, is to really take away the stigma around sexual health, and also to hand the baton of pleasure back to the people who deserve it. The response to the magazine has really been affirming. in that we cover things like boundaries, consent, gender and sexuality, gender-based violence, delaying sexual debut, and also innovations around HIV and AIDS, as well as abortion and vaccines. And some of the feedback has been people who have premenstrual depression who were like, I didn't know what to call it, and now I know what to call it. People who struggled with the guilt and shame around sex and sexual pleasure, and to say, I thought that the things that I was feeling and the desires I was feeling were unnatural, and now I've gotten validation. And also being able to put out pieces of publication that are well researched and understand what is needed by communities has been one of the biggest wins, and it is really amazing to be at the center of that kind of work.
That was a short video on Eve's Apple, a digital magazine about sex, sexuality, gender, pleasure, and more. We are going to take a short break, but we'll be back with more after this. Welcome back. You're still watching The Woman Show, and we are speaking about gender, sexuality, sex, and pleasure. I am so excited to introduce my guest, Kanyisa Booi, who is the founding editor of the digital magazine Eve's Apple. She's also a pleasure activist, and she does a host of other things. Kanyisa, welcome, and thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me, Lenina.
So, Kanyisa, I'm so excited for this conversation. I'm expecting to learn a lot from you, but we're going to start with Eve's Apple. Tell us about the magazine. Tell us what it is, what we can expect to find inside there, why you started it, and also what is the aim of the publication?
So the publication is a digital publication. It's a feminist sexual health and pleasure magazine. And actually it came on after the exit of Cosmo in the peak of COVID in 2020. It really was a culmination of my knowledge and understanding in the sexual and reproductive health, and just realizing that what Cosmo offered in terms of understanding of specific things in popular culture was something that we could also do as a magazine. So we put it together, and the first issue came out in August 2020. And I think one of the biggest aims for us is to take research works, campaign works, people's lived experiences, and put it into a unit that is fresh to the eye because people remember things that they enjoyed, a unit that's also really light to read, but also it's information that when you do in fact need it, you'd be able to remember it. And look, we're looking at specifically women and queer people. Men can get involved should they so choose. And it is really about them being empowered with knowledge. And also us getting feedback of what they need. And also just because we know that people in specific age groups are already guardians or parents, it's also quite useful then for the magazine to kind of help you out with things that you might not have clarity on. So it's a two-pronged effect where you learn for yourself and you enjoy it for yourself, but the learnings can also translate so that you can share it with other people who you might be guardians to.
Thank you. That sounds amazing. And so also, one of the things that I was thinking of is that it's a magazine talking about things, sex is taboo. And I was trying to measure like what is more taboo than the other. But in many, many circles, just sex itself is still, unmentionable, unspoken about. We're not supposed to. This is how we grew up. And so it's really interesting. I wanted to just touch on LGBTQIA plus. The crew is saying it sounds like I rehearsed it, but this acronym, it's funny in the way people interact with it, right? I've come across many different ways. Some people are great and it's fluid and it flows off the tongue, and they've made the effort to memorize it or know it. They understand the importance of it. For most people, however, when I find myself in social settings, people say LGB and then sort of taper off, or
right.
be very dismissive about it. Now, I'm not saying that it is intentional. It's long, it's hard, but I think it's great that the language is emerging for different types of gender and sexuality and sex. That the language around sex is expanding, but there's still a lot of discomfort around it. So, in the latest issue, Eve's Apple did a glossary of these different sort of terms and definitions, and I was wondering if you could run us through some of it.
All right, so I think it's critical for what's important to understand is that if we're interested in something, we learn about it, right? So we know how the latest lingo flows. We know what's in the news right now. If you're interested in war, you'll find out about how that works. If you're interested in different facets of your life, you will find ways to learn about it. And this is why it's really, really critical for us to learn about the LGBTI community, right? Because LGBTI plus community, because it's not just people somewhere in a corner. I'm a bisexual woman, so I'm the B in the LGBTI acronym, right? And so there's different individuals that are in our lives that identify in the specific ways. And the reason why the acronym exists is because these are also marginalized communities. So if you're looking at lesbians, the lesbian experience in South Africa, as soon as you think lesbian, you're probably thinking about some of the hardships that lesbians have experienced in this country. If you think about queer people, recent spades of people getting killed. So it's really, really critical for people to learn. Once they learn, there's an understanding that comes with that. So I'm going to just kind of give you the run through as you've requested. So you've got the L, which is lesbian, women who attracted to other women. This is romantically and their relationship with other women. So even sexually, they're attracted to other women. And then you've got gay, which is the G. It's men who are interested and attracted to other men romantically. And then you've got the B, which is bisexual. I am not just interested in men, I'm interested in women. And sometimes bisexual people are not. So also in thinking about this, we're not just talking about, I'll come to the trans, but I'm not just talking about women according to your definition, sex assigned at birth, but I'm talking about women, whether or not the sex assigned at birth was woman. We'll also touch on that quite quickly. And then you've got T, which is trans. So trans is my assigned sex at birth is girl, and it's a vagina. So I've got a vagina, and my sex was then girl. But I might find that actually my gender identity, what I see myself is my place in the world and how I experience the world is that of a man. And so in that instance, I would be a transgendered man. So when you would see me, I'd probably be showing far more masculine tendencies. Sometimes it doesn't happen because sometimes it's really difficult to kind of be able to express that. So my gender expression should be that of a man. You should be seeing a man when you look at me because I identify as a man, right? And then there is transgendered woman. Transgendered woman is sex assigned at birth is boy, it's a penis, but how they experience the world is that of a woman. So you're likely to see someone who looks like me, whose sex assigned at birth was a boy or, a penis. Anatomically, they may have still got a penis walking around with that. And then you've got I, which is intersex. Intersex is part of this community primarily because also intersex people are marginalized. And also we're talking about people here who might have what we call an undergrown penis or an overgrown vagina, where the anatomy itself was in transition and it didn't fully grow out. You might present a vagina, but you might also still have testes that are inside the body. An example of an intersex person is Caster Semenya. She's been quite vocal. She presents a vagina, but she's got high levels of testosterone. And then you've got Q, which is queer. Gender queer people are people who do not necessarily ascribe or they don't present or show themselves the way that we expect them to. So it's not about my sexuality, it's not about my gender. I am just what I am, and you just have to deal with it. And so the acronym is A plus because there's so many other expressions and discoveries that we're finding day to day, which are critical when I say that respect and understanding becomes an important part, because a person can be like, oh no, there's people who are called gender fluid, right? The one day you see me with my weave, I'm looking cute as up. The other day I am looking incredibly masculine, and you're like, what's your story? What's going on? And actually, I'm gender fluid. It shouldn't matter. It's actually really, truly, if we thought about it, none of our business. We should be able to just respect people and be with people according to what they choose for themselves.
Thank you, Kanyisa. Wow, there was a lot to take in, but it was so useful, and it also helps us to understand. And I think once, as you said, we learn about these things, and once we understand it, it's easier to start sort of remembering it and then knowing it and respecting other people regardless of what our own beliefs are. I saw a post on Instagram the other day, which was very interesting. And I, as a journalist, perhaps have always, now with language, my phobia is about mispronouncing names, etc., mispronouncing words. I saw something that people are quite nervous about getting the acronym wrong, or getting pronouns wrong, getting, anything related to gender and sexuality wrong. And there's a lot to know. As you've said, there's a plus means that there's so much more. But what this person said was that if you do, a good way is not to make a big thing out of it. It's to just self-correct, apologize, even ask for the appropriate term, and then just treat it like, it's normal.
Yeah.
But which is great, because I think what you're doing also with your publication is what we really want to do is normalize, So I just wanted to ask you also, in your experience and in working with this content and working with people, like, how should people approach this if they're not 100% comfortable with the language?
Right. So I think it's critical, particularly pronouns. So your pronouns would be your she, her, he, him, they, them, and even the pronouns in other countries, they get quite jazzy, like they get quite mixed in the way that they're expressed. The easiest way to ask the person what the pronouns are. This is important because then you don't necessarily run the risk of then misgendering a person. And misgendering simply means that you might have a perception of what I identify as, and that perception might be incorrect. And so you might say she to me, and my pronouns are maybe they, them, because I am queer, I'm gender non-conforming, which means gender for me is not necessarily a thing I ascribe to. So when you say they to me, then you are speaking to me, because I am a collection of things. It doesn't matter. It's not important. I don't conform to gender norms. And then there's she, her, whether a woman, is neither here nor there. The critical thing here is that I identify as a woman, and therefore I want you to call me her, I want you to call me she. And with he, him as well, it's the same. So I think the easiest way is to ask, what are your pronouns? And of course, there are moments where you will misgender someone, and apologize, and then you correct yourself. And there are instances like, I like saying guys, I like saying girl, and sometimes it's like, you have to kind of either explain that for me, the expression of guys is not gendered, so please don't take offense, or you kind of mind yourself and say, folks, hey folks, because then folks is all encompassing, and you don't necessarily constantly have to catch yourself. Popular culture does trip us out, because now it's like child, girl, oh guys, but like, it's also the awareness, because when you've got the awareness, then it kind of ensures that you are always having that lens of the other person in mind.
Thank you. And I mean, it's so interesting. I mean, I read a lot about language now, and I read a lot. I've read a lot of books now that have said, language is what makes up the world, really. Our world is made up of names and just descriptions, and just all of it. It informs our entire construct. And so this is why these conversations and this language and the emerging narratives are so important. I want to go back a little bit. We were talking about sort of sex being taboo. This is still a given. We see books coming out all the time by women who were speaking about how we never learned anything. This morning, when I was thinking about this interview, I thought that girls grow up with warnings, right? And boys grow up being advised to use condoms. So girls are warned not to have sex at all, and boys are warned to use condoms. And I thought that was really interesting. But I've always thought that I was pretty, baseline open about talking about sex. But when I gave birth to my daughter, something interesting emerged. Everyone had given me, I had a baby shower, everyone gave me gifts. They told me lots of tips and tricks about the baby and how to manage the baby and all of this stuff. No one told me what a beating your vagina takes after you give birth. Like, I was like surprised. I was so surprised. I got on the phone and I called all my friends who had given birth before and said, how could you not have told me about this? And the answer was that, oh, well, we don't really talk about it. We don't talk about vaginas. So that was such a turning point for me. And I thought, is this the world that we're living in? We don't talk about vaginas. And I have a few other examples, because after that comment, so many other things opened up. The fact that I had a girl, and I just want to say this, because for me it was such a great comparison. I have heard people interrogating boy babies' penises for as long as I can remember, right? The fact that they play with them, that they pee up in the air, like we've seen it on TV, and yet nothing prepares you actually for taking care of a girl's genitals. I'm speaking as a mother. So, which for me was just so strange. We just don't talk about it. And so I wanted to ask you, is that part of this conversation that you're trying to start also with the magazine? Because I know that in previous issues, there's been a lot of discussion and also a broader narrative about vaginas. Now, what is the vagina versus the clitoris versus the vulva versus like all of those things? How important is it for us to talk about these things?
I think it goes back to what you were saying about language. Once we find language for things, it becomes easier for us to be able to, it gives us a comfort because we can name things, right? And the thing about the fact that we even call it a vagina, because it's not actually a vagina, it's a vulva. The vagina is the opening, right? The vulva is where other things, like when people talk about a vagina, they're actually imagining the vulva, right? The actual face of the vulva, right? And so you find that one of the reasons why people don't necessarily talk about, even with babies, what it means to care for a vagina is because then they would have to admit that it matters and it exists, right? And its functions are far greater, which is amazing, than just the birthing process, because, well, there's also the C-section now, which kind of, takes that and puts it to the side sometimes, right? And I think it's really about erasure, the erasure of femininity in that form, erasure of the existence of women, and also the existence of women being in relation to that of men. So, you can talk about masturbation, like boys are known to masturbate, right? But if a little girl touches herself, if a teenager touches herself, who owns a vulva, suddenly, this child is very sexual. Where did you see this? You as a grown woman worry that like the guilt and the shame attached to your self-exploration is very much linked to how the world views how you can claim ownership of your vulva, firstly. Secondly, of who you think you are, to even begin to imagine that pleasure, the vulva, and everything attached to it belongs to you. And so someone not telling you how to clean your daughter's vulva is like quite odd, because there's very specific ways of how to clean it in the first place. It's quite sensitive. It needs minimal anything, just warm water and nothing else. Because now if you take the wet wipes and you're wiping with that baby powdered smell, you might risk harming her. But nobody told you that. But how are you supposed to know that you're not supposed to use soap on there? Yeah. And so it really is about our place in the world as vulva owners, and how the world perceives us and what they think we deserve to know and not know.
Wow. I mean, that's a lot. And you raise such important points. Exactly. No one tells you not to use those things. And I didn't even want to go deep into, I think just speaking about the vulva is going to be a whole other show, because cleanliness and I mean, I have brothers, so even just the comparison about the emphasis that has been put on cleanliness, on everything else about the smell. There are, people have phobias about the smell. I mean, things that are coming out now, which is great on social media, but that still we struggle to talk about. Kanyisa, this is such a great conversation, but we have to take a quick break, and so we will be back with more after this. Welcome back. You're still watching The Woman Show, and we are in studio with Kanyisa Booi, the founder of Eve's Apple, a digital magazine, as well as a pleasure activist. And we are speaking about gender, sexuality, sex, and pleasure. And this second segment is going to be focused on looking at female pleasure and unpacking that. Now, Kanyisa, we're going to speak about female pleasure, but that in itself is still very taboo. And so, on the far end of the spectrum, we live in a world where female genitals are mutilated. Literally, the clitoris, which is the pleasure center for women, is cut off. And on the other side, we don't really, traditionally, female pleasure has not even been a topic or a subject or thought of, and sex has often just been centered around male pleasure. So sex is finished, when men ejaculate or orgasm. So tell us why consciousness raising around female pleasure is so important.
So pleasure is, in actual fact, the World Health Organization recognizes pleasure as an important part of the holistic spectrum of health. So really, truly speaking, when we're talking about sexual and reproductive health, pleasure is included. Pleasure is a very critical part of our lives. Some of us know the kind of food that we enjoy eating. We like the kind of color. We know the kind of colors that we like. There's very specific things that we like beam when we talk about because we love them so much. But for whatever reason, when it comes to sexual pleasure, we struggle to express what that is. And in part, it is about the mind, how as a gender, feminine expressing people, women, and also gay men who are feminine expressing, in the world are told that they shouldn't be too forward. How many times has a person been told, "Don't be forward"? Who think that being forward in expressing what brings them pleasure makes them a person who's undesirable. And then it comes to body, desirability politics, like what is a good body? Which body deserves to have sex? Which body deserves to have pleasurable sex? And who does sex actually please? Now, there is a study that shows that there is even an orgasm gap, right? So heterosexual men, so men who sleep with women, 96% of the time, they will get orgasms. And then when it comes to women who are heterosexual, it is 66%, like the cap is significant, right? And then you've got women who sleep with other women, and there it's 86% of the time where there is sexual pleasure. And that shows you that intentionally, there is no intentionality behind pleasuring a woman. And this is, like I said, this is body and mind, right? For example, a person like myself who is fat, people like myself don't think that they're desirable. And when they are, they think that someone's doing them a favor. And even then, they don't bring their whole bodies and themselves into that interaction because they feel like, oh, I don't want to be too much. What if they don't come back again? And so it really is about how we're socialized, how systems, our communities, our parents, our friends tell us not to be. And then that takes away from our thinking around what could be pleasurable for us.
Wow, I love that you bring that up. I know you and I actually previously had a conversation about body politics, and I told you I read that book, My Body is Not an Apology. But within that conversation, we were speaking about how, especially for women, It might not
Yes,
be. There are movements and narratives emerging now that men also experience body politics and,
right.
and shame around their bodies and the types of bodies that they have, weight, etc. And so,
Right.
but just looking at how the power dynamics play out when you are, depending how far on the spectrum you are away from the ideal woman, which has been presented
Yes,
to us in media over and over and over and continues to be, right? So,
yes.
it's amazing that you brought that up. I wanted to ask you though. I want to move into one of the articles in the latest issue. Also, it's about pleasure. It is titled "Navigating the Needs of Our Bodies Outside of the Male Gaze." And it's
Mm,
focusing on an album and some music by Miss Sullivan. And I wanted you to just tell us more because that title itself just struck me, you know. And
right.
and I think I want to just verbalize um, for the audience also that just thinking about yourself as deserving of pleasure is a radical thing. I say that because for me, I found like reading things like this, it's just the socialization is so deep that you don't realize it. But when we think about experiencing pleasure outside of, what did I say? Outside of the male gaze, what does it mean?
So our earlier conversation was around people don't talk about vaginas, and we're talking about when we do talk about it, it is in relation to the men's experience and the outcome of that. So, for example, I've known about sex for as early as about 8 because my mom was quite open, but it was in relation to what would happen to me if I had sex. It had nothing to do with how my experience would be. So when we're talking about pleasure, sensuality, and sex outside of the male gaze, it is really centering yourself. What does Lenina actually want? And it's really the understanding that pleasure is not just sexual intercourse. That's an eventuality. Like it could happen, it could not happen. And without that, even then, there could be pleasure. So outside of the male gaze says, what does a person who looks like me, who speaks like me, who lives in a body like mine want? It's like regardless of what mainstream media says, regardless of what my parents in their time thought, regardless of what my peers keep telling me, what do I want? Right? What if there were no men? What if masculinity didn't exist? What if my being was never in relation to whoever imagines a woman to be because they're men or because men exist? What does that look like? Right? And then we would have issues with things like, women wouldn't be called, like the album says, hoes. There'd be no hotels, women would be far more sexually expressive because fundamentally it's a basic need, it's as basic as food. And I'm talking about this for people who are not asexual, because we know that those people are also asexual. Pleasure is not just about how a man looks at you. It's when you're enjoying that piece of smoked rib, or like you've had the juiciest piece of melon and you're chewing it with your mouth open, with the juice dripping down your face, with the ultimate most of enjoyment. It is being by yourself in your room, imagining the most fantastic destination and having self-pleasure by yourself, imagining what that is like. And so it is existence of pleasure for women outside of what men and society imagines them to be and what they should want.
I mean, there's a lot coming up, Kanyisa, about female orgasm now, also, in terms of narrative. And so I'm sure, and I love that you spoke about all the different types of pleasure. Another thing we've spoken about is how, there's been the erasure of the narrative around female pleasure for the longest time. There's been no narrative about it, right? So the erasure of that.
And then he just discovered the clitoris. Are you joking?
Right, exactly.
Like the anatomy of the clitoris has recently been documented. Recently, like in the 1900s, How ridiculous is that? That it's on in the health medical books, it's been in recent times that the anatomy of the clitoris has been discovered. With all our knowledge, because there was no intentionality. Because essentially, the only reason the clitoris exists is for your pleasure, it's for your orgasms, whether it's penetrative or it's on top, it doesn't matter. That's the only existence. And so I think, really, truly speaking, the reason why it's so hard for people to talk about this is because, well, there was no name for it and we didn't know what it looked like. We just knew it worked.
Yeah. Which essentially means that our bodies were created in part to experience pleasure. It is part of our purpose here on earth, right? And I think what I was getting to also is that this disconnection from sexual pleasure, or this erasure of sexual pleasure for women, sort of often translates into an erasure of pleasure all the way down, right? And that's what you were speaking, and that's why you brought up, which was wonderful, just not just the sexual pleasure, but the pleasure of other things, of, having your favorite food, and things that women often deny themselves automatically, right? You spoke about the orgasm gap earlier. Can you tell us a little bit more about that? And what does the landscape look like, or could it look like, or should it look like, when women start to prioritize their own orgasms?
Right. So when it comes to the orgasm gap, it was a study that's done to check how women experience, well, not even how women experience pleasure, if women experience pleasure, because the understanding is that bodies and minds and our existence is political. And by the time we have to speak about safe sex, it really truly is about whether or not we believe that sex belongs to us too, because then if we do, then perhaps our behaviors would be different, and our sessions around consent and boundaries would be different, right? Understanding the power dynamics. And so the study then found that 96% of the times a man will orgasm. And men have always been encouraged to orgasm. I mean, people will talk about, we know about wet dreams, right? We know about men masturbating. We know about men ejaculating in 2 seconds. Or what we don't know is about women ejaculating in 2 seconds. We don't know that in Uganda, there's a tribe who teaches men how to make women squirt, because we don't think that that's important. And really, it is about relationally, do men who sleep with women care about the pleasure of women? So now we're talking specifically about heterosexual sex, wherein if I can make myself orgasm in 5 minutes, surely someone who's interested in my pleasure would then be able to do just about the same, because it's not really complex. And it is really about the patriarchal understanding of who and what sex is and who it belongs to. And so the landscape is starting to shift. You're seeing a lot of boobs and butts on the internet because there's an insistence for ownership of our bodies. You're seeing it in all shapes and sizes. There's been a whole lot of discernment, and women are not hearing it. You're seeing a shoot up of conversations around sexual enjoyment, like sex just for pleasure. You're seeing a lot of women saying, you know what, I'd like to be child-free. I want to have the sex, I want to have the enjoyment of the sex, but I don't want to have the byproduct of the sex. So that's too. And this is really a direct result of people then understanding, you know what, my body belongs to me. And pleasure, much unlike what we were told, doesn't come with consequences that are dire. And so I think with growing, for us as people who are guardians and parents, we have a responsibility to take our children through the paces, things that we've kind of learned and understood for ourselves. Obviously, this is important for it to be age specific. What is joy? What is enjoyment? You know, I was watching Pleasure Principles, and this lady was talking about how at some point she was gyrating against a couch and she could feel pleasure, but then she got hit, right? And she was laying on the bed and she had discovered the clitoris and she was rubbing it, and her mother was side-eyeing her. But what would it look like if her mother said, you know, if you're gonna do that, girl, please close the door, okay? We're not interested in being party to that aspect of your life. We want you to enjoy it. We encourage it to do your best. great. Just like they do with boys. It would be a completely different experience. There would be a set of ownership where, and also like sexual pleasure does not mean sexual intercourse. And this is really critical because when we talk about sex, already it's red flags, danger. And people don't think about the fact that a 15-year-old starts to get feelings because now their hormones are telling them specific things. And they don't give them the tools. So, you can masturbate, you can kiss, you can touch. These are the things you can look at. And if you're feeling any specific way, ask me a question. Let's have a look at this. I'm not sure about this. It's very important for parents to also say, I'm not certain about this. You must maybe just look it up together. Get excited about specific thing. Girl, did you see they've got this little vibrator that you just put on top? It's great. These are important because it says, first of all, this person can come and talk to you. Secondly, that you too experience specific urges, and there's absolutely nothing wrong with that. In fact, pleasure should be encouraged. And I think the landscape is changing because younger people are saying, I'm going to get mine, I'm going to get my protection. And of course, there needs to be conversations about what it means for one to be safe. But for the most part, we need to have more conversation about what pleasure looks like and how enjoyment looks like and why it's an important part of being a human being, like you said.
I mean, that was so great. Thank you, Kanyisa. Also, I love that you brought up those examples about how young girls are shamed. And I've also seen it in a few books mentioned that way. So pleasure takes on sort of negative connotations from a very, very early age. And I know, and there's one activist in Cape Town, for instance, a young woman. I think she said, she started a campaign called "Girls Are Not Ogat," because which is ogat, which is a shaming word, and we're so familiar with it. You show any sort of sign of anything, whether it's could just be talking to another boy child, whatever. Girls are told not to be ogat, don't act like that, which essentially means don't act sexualized in any way whatsoever. And so I think what a lot of women experience now, and these conversations I did worry, are they triggering, for some people just to hear and to listen about these things, because again, the socialization is so ingrained. So for women to speak about sex, think about sex, speak about pleasure, think about pleasure is actually could be a very uncomfortable experience depending on how those topics have been contextualized for them. I want to ask you, because a lot of the content that goes into Eve's Apple are also designed to sort of, some of it is how-tos, some of it is really educational to help people understand, but also to help them sort of shift and move forward. For someone who is interested in exploring, owning their bodies more, experiencing more pleasure, what are sort of gentle ways that you could suggest that they could start that might not be so overwhelming for them?
So I'm going to start with this and say that this question has been asked a few times and we've been moved to act. Today we're going to be putting out a post if you check our social media. Next week we're starting pleasure practice sessions. The pleasure practice sessions are really taking from some of the information we've put out in the magazine and some of the information that already exists in the world to get you to a place where shame and guilt are not emotions or feelings that you attach when you think about pleasure. And truly is an intentional 10-day, 10 sessions of taking you through that, easing into the knowledge and understanding of what pleasure is for you and the comfort of being able to settle into that knowledge. But for the purposes of this question, I think one of I don't know, you guys can look out Lisa Welsh. She talks a lot about microdosing pleasure. One of the things I always say is it starts with food. What do you like to eat? For example, I am a putu and mas, steak medium rare, sushi, and bubbles girl. These are the things that when I am sitting and having those things, I cannot explain the joy. I'm unable to explain the joy. And anytime and also like fundamentally, beyond the shadow of a doubt, without question, coffee. Like I'm gonna I didn't drink coffee this morning because I was a bit nervous. So after this, I'm gonna sit and have a cup of coffee. Why is this important? This is important because your body understands your cues from when you feel pleasure and joy. So this is like the simplest thing. What is the thing that you like to do? What do you love the most? Do you like to, when it's like 4 o'clock in the afternoon, lay out a blankie and be outside and literally feel the sun in your skin? And what does that feel like? What does that feel like? You know? And also the usefulness of pleasure is that the body learns specific things, and even when something is not right, your body gives you cues because it now understands. Sometimes people are sick for long periods of time and they don't know they're sick because they've never learned to listen to their bodies. And listening to your body is not just about what's painful, it's also what's pleasurable. So find little things like the food that you like the things you like to drink. So it's like micro dosing, finding simple things. Yeah. Simple things that give you pleasure. By the time you move to sensual and sexual, you kind of understand what are the things that bring you pleasure.
That is fantastic. Microdosing on pleasure. I love that idea. Thank you so much for joining us. I mean, this has been a riveting conversation, a very useful and a very educational conversation. And thank you so much for sharing with us.
I appreciate this, and I hope everybody finds ways to bring themselves joy and pleasure.
Yay. We are going to take a short break, but we'll be back with more after this. Welcome back. You are still watching The Woman Show, and we have been speaking about gender, sexuality, sex, and pleasure. Now, I don't know about you, but I have learned so much. To round it all off, we are going to have a look at a short video about the LGBTQIA plus movement. Let's have a look. And that brings us to the end of the show, and what a conversation it's been. If you take nothing else out of the show today, let it be that love has no gender, that language matters, and to respect everyone. I am Lenina Rasool. Goodbye.